These experiences are heartbreaking, but they are not new. These are also the experiences of my generation and my mothers and my grandmothers. If they are not to become the experiences of the next generation too, a line in the sand must be drawn. It is no longer acceptable to expect women and girls to adapt and accommodate. It is time to challenge unacceptable male behaviour and better protect women from it. We must change for good the culture of misogyny that has normalised such behaviour for far too long. And it is, of course, in this context that Baroness Helena Kennedy's working group on misogyny has this morning published its groundbreaking report. I thank Baroness Kennedy and the working group, including, of course, the late and sadly missed Emma Rich, for producing such a powerful and compelling report. Its recommendations are bold and they are far-reaching. It proposes a new Misogyny and Criminal Justice Act, and it recommends that this Act includes a statutory misogyny aggravation. Now, it is important to stress, Presiding Officer, in anticipation of concerns about freedom of thought and speech, that this would not criminalise misogyny per se, but it would allow crimes, assault for example, which are motivated by misogyny, to be treated more seriously in sentencing. Importantly, it would not apply to crimes such as rape, which are inherently misogynistic. The report also recommends 3 new criminal offences to reflect and better address the daily lived experience of too many women.
Before she elaborates any further, I just want to cast your mind back to something she said a few seconds prior, and that was, it won't restrict or prohibit freedom of expression or thought per se, right?
These would be stirring up hatred against women and girls.
And again, it comes back to the old classic argument of who defines what is and what is not stirring up hatred. Who defines whether or not it was intentional? It's literally the same arguments that were put forth at the time when the hate crime bill was initially being talked about and scrutinised in Parliament before inevitably being passed. And of course, this misogynistic bill, the misogyny bill, derives from the hate crime bill all the way back when the bill was first suggested and put forth. Sex was included, if I recall correctly. But feminist groups complained, created a shit show, or shitstorm I should say, because they weren't happy with the idea of sex being included, because that by default would have also included men. And we can't be having that here in Rainbow Unicorn Land. So the feminist cabal, led of course by none other than Nicola Thinlips, decided to remove sex from the bill as a protected characteristic, and instead, in its place, decide to create a working group led by Helena Kennedy to decide whether or not misogyny should be included at a later date as a standalone offence. Fast forward to the present day, and we now arrive at a point where the report has been published and it's been welcomed. So we all know it's going to inevitably lead to it being accepted. Every single recommendation, every single thing that the bill had, the report, why do I keep saying bill? The report had to say will be accepted in full, because that's how the Scottish Government, especially the SNP I should say, work. Every working group that they create, every single thing that they have a finger in terms of pies, every recommendation that then comes on the back of these groups, they're all accepted without fail.
Public misogynistic harassment and issuing threats of or invoking rape or sexual assault or disfigurement of women and girls, whether online or offline.
And what's the difference between doing that to a boy than a girl online? Nothing screams out equality quite like excluding misandry or men and boys in a hate crime bill, but including women and girls. But again, it's all about protecting all those groups that are classified as marginalised across society. None of which really are marginalised, but it's oppressor versus oppressed. And it just so happens that in Scottish society, according to these pricks, the oppressors are able-bodied straight white men. But anyway, honestly, the way that the politicians, one by one, took to the podiums to talk about feminism, oppression, misogyny, etc., etc. And all of them took a turn to refer to this, as you can see on the screen, the misogyny report from Helena Kennedy. They all spoke about it as if this was the second coming of Christ, but it come back in the form of a report, a digital report. You know, this is the golden truth, the be-all and end-all, the report to end all, and the report to provide the cast iron proof that misogyny is a fucking rampant issue in society. And right off the bat, first page, or page 3 anyway, misogyny, a human rights issue. And it gets much better. You know, when I read this morning, within like page 7, page 8, immediately, I just knew that this was going to be a pile of shite. And I'll prove my case right now. So I'll skip past this briefly because while it's in the top of my head. So it says here, in page 8, misogyny. What is it? Misogyny is prejudice, malice and or contempt for women. Sadly, it is rife in our society. Literalists cling to the word's origins and insist that misogyny means hatred of women, but it means more than that. We're off to a great start, you know? How dare people decide to stick to the definition of a word instead of bowing and kowtowing to people that wish to expand the goalposts in terms of definition? You know, if we bow to this bullshit and allow these people to start to expand the goalposts and allow misogyny to encompass a plethora of different things in its definition, you open the possibility for these people to include whatever they want. And that's exactly what's beginning to occur here. Because as it says, the word has evolved to encompass the more widely held attitudes and behaviours that relegate women to a subordinate position and maintain the power imbalance which characterises male to female relations. So you're already getting a bit of insight as to what the fuck this is really about in terms of cracking down on misogyny or talking about the epidemic of misogyny that plagues society. Power imbalances, so-called subordinate positions, aka disparities, aka equity is required under the guise of equality. Disparities indicate inequality. You know? Power imbalances. How do we rectify a power imbalance? Well, in the case of the parliament, well, it's a no-brainer, is it not? Just continue to vote in women. Women only shortlists, 50-50, at least 50-50. You know? It is these attitudes and the conduct which flows from them which prevent us achieving a genuine equality. A genuine equality. You know, again, equality is another word that they've redefined. They've taken the word equality and they have been given carte blanche to expand the goalposts and incorporate whatever the hell they want into the definitions of inequality and or equality. You know? Women and men are equal on paper in terms of all the rights that they all have. They both have, I should say. There is not one right in this country that a man has that a woman does not. That should be the end of the discussion. But that's not good enough. Now it's time to shift the goalposts. Now it's time to look further afield. And manufacture new problems by pointing to disparities. There's not enough women in this specific job field. There's too many men over here, etc., etc. Make no mistake, however, actual hatred of women does exist. Recent example is the group of men referred to as incels, who now populate parts of the internet sharing poisonous attitudes about women, threatening and taking violent action. But in conducting this work, we relied upon a more general definition of misogyny, which acknowledges the patriarchal nature of our society. The patriarchal nature of our society. I think anybody who's not bought into this delusional worldview that these people possess could probably agree, maybe after a bit of discussion, but nonetheless, they'd come to an agreement at some point, that we're now, if we're not already, we're headed towards a matriarchy. I mean, the powers will with feminism. Every single policy that comes out seems to be pro-feminist. Nicola Thinlips herself has already come out and said that the country itself is now a feminist country. Our first minister is an ardent feminist, apparently. Really screams out patriarchy to me. Especially when our ethnic boys, white boys, the demographic that's failing the most in society on average. Yeah. Homelessness, suicides, drug deaths, etc. Mainly males. You know. Women do much better in education. Higher education. But yeah, it's a patriarchy apparently. It's a patriarchy in the worldview of the feminists. It's a patriarchy on paper in the book of ideology created by the social constructionists and the feminists. And this is the issue, something that I addressed in my stream to a certain extent. And I also said it on Telegram on my post about it. That what we're seeing here is the feminist worldview, and they're just taking extracts from the Book of Feminism and they're presenting it. In the case of the Parliament, when they were taking turns at their podiums, or in this, same shit included within that little paragraph there, just taking little extracts and presenting it as if it's fact, as if it's in fact reality. It's not. It's only reality in the worldview of a feminist. Anyway, I've just spent near enough 10 minutes on the fucking first page. 80 pages, I'm not going through all of it, but there's another part in this though. I love this bit. I think it was... Wait, sorry. Where the fuck? Few men actually hate women, but many men still harbour deeply ingrained attitudes about male primacy and manifest a deep sense of entitlement with regard to women and their bodies. I would make the argument that there's a serious sense of self-entitlement coming from feminists in particular. You know? Nonetheless, the experiences of misogynistic harassment, particularly of a sexual nature, place limits on women's lives. They create a climate of fear and barriers to women and girls fully participating in society and realising their human rights. There is hardly a woman who does not self-safeguard, taking precautions to avoid potential threat, risk assessing from an early age. Girls are warned from childhood that they must avoid putting themselves in harm's way, that it is they who must learn behaviours that might afford them protection from predatory or violent men. They internalise the message that it will be their fault if something happens to them. They are on watch throughout their lives, protecting themselves by avoiding dark streets, late nights, solitary walks, etc. Now, as I said in the stream, so I'm not going to go over old ground to a large extent, but, you know, men walking home alone at night, there's just as much danger in terms of being attacked. But I've been in positions myself in the past where I know it's anecdotal, but I've been in positions myself in the past where I've been walking from A to B at night when it's late, especially in areas that I'm either not familiar with or a bit more run down in comparison to other areas. And yeah, naturally an element of fear or uneasiness comes over you. So naturally the same thing would be applicable for females. And I'm not disputing that there isn't predatory men out there. I'm not disputing that there was a potential for harm to come their way, the same way that harm could come to a male's way. But I think it's to a certain extent over-dramatised. I think to a large extent even, it could be argued, they're making this a bigger issue than it is. You know, in terms of suggesting that every single time a woman steps outside her house, there is the potential to be put in harm's way. I'm not entirely sure that's entirely accurate. Nonetheless, I don't really want to digress too much on all this pish because there's a lot of pages to get through. But down here as well, I love the justification for why they've not included misandry. You know, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, hate and hate crime. Let us be clear. Hate itself is not a crime, much as we would like to derive hateful thinking out of our lives. Misogyny is not a crime. People are free to admire, to love, and to hate. We may deplore that people hate others because of their race or their religion or their sexuality or their womanhood. What about their manhood? But the business of hating is not itself a crime. No child starts life hating. It is learnt. It is the conduct that flows from hatred that can be criminal. But what goes on in our heads cannot and must not be criminalised. Okay. We were very clear from the outset that misogyny itself must not be criminalised as a way of thinking, and freedom of thought must remain sacrosanct. Thought crime is the stuff of totalitarianism, and people in a free society have to be able to have to be free to think the unthinkable. It's funny because at the same time, on the same token, we have social constructionists and social engineers such as the SNP and Education Scotland, etc., hell-bent on completely reshaping the way that children see the world. So, on the one hand, it might be against or a breach of human rights to start tinkering or trying to prevent the way that people think, thought crimes, etc. But at the same token, you're trying to change the way that people think in order to prevent so-called thought crimes. Anyway, it's down here, sorry. In general, the law prefers to operate on the basis of neutrality, meaning most laws must be available to men as well as women. However, we would argue that the prevailing belief that the law should be neutral with regard to sex and or gender disguises the reality that there are particular kinds of behaviour which target women. There has been insufficient examination of the more generally experienced abuses to which women are subjected and which emanate from male behaviour. The daily round of insult and harassment. Right? So, their justification or their reasoning for why misandry was not included alongside misogyny in the hate crime bill as a protected characteristic is because there are specific behaviours that are pervasive, according to them, in society from male behaviour that specifically target and by extension affect women. Even if that was to be the case and was to be believed and taken at face value as truth, that does not negate from why misandry couldn't be included as well. You know, that has got to be one of the most irrelevant justifications for why misogyny has been included, but misandry has been left out. Anyway, so everybody knows if you pick up a dictionary and look at what misogyny is defined as, it's simply, to put it in layman's terms, a hatred of women. But oh no, not according to the feminists of the 21st century. Misogyny is a way of thinking that upholds the primary status of men and a sense of male entitlement, while subordinating women and limiting their freedom and power. Conduct based on this thinking can include a range of abusive and controlling behaviours, including rape, sexual offences, harassment, bullying, and domestic abuse. I mean, where to begin with this? So, bullying can occur to anybody, you know? And if we're to take this at face value, if misogyny is the reason for why some men bully women, when a man bullies another man, what is that then? And as for domestic abuse, you know, this completely ignores male on male domestic abuse cases, female on female domestic abuse cases, which by the way are pretty prevalent, and female on male abuse cases. The only way that this could make any sense, the only way that you could get away with saying that domestic abuse occurs due to misogyny would be if every single case, 100% of the time, every single reported case, every single trial, etc., was always a man on a woman in terms of the man being the abuser and the woman being the victim. But the fact is, women do it to men, women do it to other women, and men do it to other men. Therefore, the narrative of domestic abuse being a result of misogyny falls flat on its face, dissipates. Or it would dissipate if we were to bring these up in conversation and debates. But instead of that, they're just ignored in order to cement this narrative. You know? And as for abusive and or controlling type behaviours, the people that kind of embroil themselves in that are not exactly what we would consider wired up right to begin with, you know? Because the vast majority of people don't act like that in relationships. And as for rape, that's self-explanatory, is it not? People that do that, they're not exactly what would be considered your everyday guy. You know, again, you'd have to be somewhat wired up wrong. But I could raise the point though. What happens when men rape other men? Or the instances where women do rape men? I'm not saying they're as common, but they do occur. You know, attributing all of these things to misogyny. But that can only be true if all the things included there happen one way, but they don't, do they? So when they happen the opposite way, what do we blame that on then? What do we attribute that to? Misandry? Outdated stereotypes? Underrepresentation? We think that harmful conduct, which has its roots in misogyny, should have consequences. After much debate, we think a distinct and separate statutory misogyny aggravation should be made available in new legislation so that a judge has to take account of the misogynistic nature of the conduct when sentencing. It's funny because if you come right back up to the top quickly, literally the general summary starts off by saying, when I was asked to look at the hate crime legislation, which was being debated in Rainbow Unicorn Land at the beginning of 2021, the central question was why were women being excluded from the proposed new law? You know? And then it says down here, women were forcefully asking, what about us? I mean, firstly, there's an element of revising history at play with what I just read out there, because it's not exactly hard to remember. It wasn't that long ago. It was only a year ago. Sex was removed from the bill initially because of feminists complaining that the term or the protected characteristics of sex would have included men or misandry. But it then goes on, as I just read out, what about us, etc., etc. Why weren't women included? So they're already setting off from a premise that the ideal outcome from the people behind this report and this working group would like to see misogyny inevitably become a protected characteristic or a standalone offence. So you could argue there's an element of bias at play there, but we all knew that this was going to be the outcome. Anyway, this should be possible for most offences, such as assault or threatening behaviour, criminal damage, or online offences committed under the Communications Act when there is evidence of misogyny. The offence is considered more serious in these cases and would justify a more grave response. As with other statutory aggravations, the misogyny aggravation will not require corroboration. I mean, it's a simple question to pose. Why not include misandry as well? It's all about equality, is it not? But it's not, is it? It's been suggested that hate crime established to deal with prejudice, malice, and ill will towards minorities does not work particularly well for women. Hate is not a useful concept when it comes to the malign conduct that men display towards women and the attitudes behind this conduct. We advise that the aggravation defines misogyny as being prejudice and or malice and or contempt towards women. Ill will does not describe what men feel when they abuse or degrade women. I'm just so sick of this whole concept of hate crimes and marginalisation, etc., etc. Because if you think about it, the entire bill is centred around protecting every group in society against men. White men, I should say. Says up here, the standard of proof is high in criminal matters, beyond reasonable doubt, and women should be aware that introducing this new aggravation as part of the toolkit to address misogyny will not of itself create the change. A hate crime aggravation has not eliminated racism. It is clear to the working group that more is needed, of course. And I wonder what that might be. Presumably more to be done in the education front, yeah? The working group was very clear that the new aggravation should only be available for offences which are not misogynistic by definition, i.e. offences which are not inherently grounded in misogyny. The new aggravation should be available for all other crime like assault, criminal damage, and offences such as threatening behaviour, including shouting, swearing, uttering threats, brandishing a weapon, all of which might be covered by sections 38 and 39 of the Criminal Justice and Licensing Act, as long as there is evidence of misogyny. Alright. The aggravation should not apply to rape, other sexual offences or domestic abuse, which are offences by their nature imbued with misogyny, And what do they mean by that? Well, again, it's the power imbalances, etc. Attitudes, outdated stereotypes. But I pose the question again. If rape has been attributed to misogyny, what happens when a man rapes another man? Can't blame misogyny then. Can't attribute that to misogyny. Is that misandry? Oh, fuck's sake. Assaults, as well as other crimes which occur in the context of domestic relationships and are thus often gendered and are already subject to an aggravation. Judges should take into account the background of an existing or former relationship between the parties. Therefore, we're referring to an Abusive Behaviour and Sexual Harm Act. Therefore, the misogyny aggravation should not apply to crimes where the aggravation in the 2016 Act can be applied. Rape and sexual assault are grave, not least because of the misogyny involved. For decades, women's organisations have been persuading lawmakers to recognise the misogynistic nature of rape as not merely a crime of lust but of power abuse, and urge courts to not introduce hierarchies of rape, e.g. rape by a stranger is seen as more serious than rape by someone known to the complainer. Well, I don't see why one would be treated differently to the other, if I'm being totally honest. But again, I really fail to see how rape is inherently attributed to misogyny. Purely for the fact that, anybody can be raped. And I would put it more down to sexuality, because if you're a gay man, you're not going to go out your way to go about raping women, are you? You're going to go out and target men. So I would say sexuality plays a role. you know, as opposed to just walking around, stalking the streets at night, desperate to find a woman because you're misogynistic. However, sexual offences need separate treatment in laws which recognise their gendered and misogynistic nature. See, my biggest point of contention with all this, and I'm not going to stop and repeat myself over and over and over again, it's just that they keep attributing misogyny to things that could happen to, you know, the other way around. Whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's rape, whether it's coercive control, whatever it may be. You know, street harassment, unwanted touching, unwanted advances, whatever. It can happen the other way around in terms of a woman could do it to a man could do it to another man, a woman could theoretically do it to another woman, as well as a man could do it to a woman. But when a man does it to a woman, it's inherently misogynistic. But there's no explanation as to what is attributed, it's attributed to when it happens in any of the other aforementioned forms. You know, nobody's disputing that these things that they're referencing don't occur. Nobody's taking anything away from these things when they do occur. What I'm simply saying is to attribute misogyny to these instances and these crimes is daft. As well as the statutory misogyny aggravation, we are recommending the creation of 3 new offences, all of which should be incorporated into the Misogyny and Criminal Justice Act. Stirring up hatred against women and girls. We recommend including in the new Misogyny and Criminal Justice Act the standalone offence of stirring up hatred against women and girls to tackle, amongst other things, the threat from incel and other extremist groups. Incel communities are bound together by an ideology which preaches hatred of women. The ideology has inspired deadly attacks and has been a recent 6-fold increase in visits to the incel websites. It shows no signs of disappearing. Also to be included, preferably, is a public misogynistic harassment. The experience of misogynistic abuse and harassment is now at epidemic levels, and for this reason we recommend the creation of a new offence of public misogynistic harassment. This new law will expand the scope of the criminal law. It will in some places cover behaviour which could already be prosecuted under laws found in varied statutes. However, by introducing an understanding of misogyny and its pernicious effect into specific legislation for women, we will concentrate the minds of investigators and prosecutors, with law being complicated and the evidence in every case being different. Prosecutors are experienced in marrying the appropriate legislation to the particular conduct, and this offence adds to the range of options available. Some of those who work within the criminal justice system take the view that laws already exist which should be used to deal with the complaints women are making of threatening or abusive behaviour, including existing laws relating to sexual offences. However, the fair labelling of offences is a principle of the rule of law. Women should know that there is a law that is clearly there for them, for when they're experiencing frightening, humiliating, degrading or abusive behaviour. This offence would not only respond to harmful behaviour, but would also act as a preventative mechanism. Women are subjected in public places to sexual touching and groping, being rubbed up against on crowded buses, sexual talk, and descriptions of what men would like to do to them. To groups of men talking loudly in public places about porn. Even if that is to be believed, that groups of men are talking loudly in public places about porn. Why the fuck's that included in there? I know, well, that offends women. There must be misogyny. But again, I'm not disputing that these things don't occur, but I think the underlying issue that I have with this is that they're trying to imply that it's a lot more common than it actually is. A lot more common. And even if this was as common as they make it out to be, again, they're falsely attributing it to misogyny. It's not like there isn't women out there that don't do this to men. And it's not like there isn't men out there that don't do it to other men, invite women to other women. There is people out there that just ain't wired up right. There is creeps. There is weirdos. There is people that ain't what would be considered normal. That doesn't excuse it, doesn't make it right. Point being, though, that they come in all shapes and sizes, and believe it or not, they come in different sexes, or they come from both sexes, I should say. Women must feel supported in reporting invasive, offensive and harassing behaviour, and they should be encouraged to report to dedicated police phone lines, websites and a dedicated app. We agree with the prevailing desire to avoid burdening boys and young men with criminal convictions which can harm their future prospects. However, there will be circumstances in which a prison sentence is appropriate. Then goes on to say, issuing threats or invoking rape, sexual assault, or disfigurement of women and girls online and off. But again, what happens when this happens to a boy online? Can't attribute it to misogyny, but it's not even a crime. Or is it a crime? It's a crime in and of itself, but it just doesn't have the additional caveat of misogyny included within. The other offence which we recommend introducing into the new statute is one of issuing threats, yada yada. Our aim is to stop the weaponising of sexually violent language. The use of threats of violation and physical damage to women is growing daily and fills women's lives with fear and distress, limiting their freedom of movement and liberty. Threatening or invoking rape has become commonplace online and off, with women in public life receiving such threats constantly, but so do schoolgirls. Okay. The use of these threats is different from threats made to men, with the threats often being couched in language which is not saying, I'm going to come and rape you. More often it is, you deserve to be raped, or I hope someone comes and rapes you, or you are too ugly to rape. The threats are implicit and a reminder to women of what the sexual penalty can be for women who incur male antagonism. Perpetrators may have absolutely no intention of carrying out the threats, but their motives are clearly misogynistic. Oh, fuck's sake. Seeking to maintain the subordinate positions of women and girls. See, this right here. Perpetrators have absolutely no intention of carrying out the threat, but their motives are clearly misogynistic. Right? Misogyny, of course, being a hatred for women. Seeking to maintain the subordinate positions of women and girls. Nobody views the world through this lens of power and power imbalances, bar feminists. You know? When somebody says some callous thing online, I mean, especially when they don't fucking mean it or have any intention of carrying it out, they're not doing so because of subordination or the need to ensure that the woman remains in her subordinate position. They're doing it because they know that it will offend them. Anyway, this is ridiculous. So the offence has been created for women because of the nature of the threats used to women, because of the particular harms that are caused, and because they are so personalised and playing to the fears which women have been schooled to internalise. This is no real different to the BAME parents that tell their little BAME child from a very young age that the whole world, the whole of society is inherently racist and against them, to be as scared of the police and as, belligerent with the police as possible because they're out to get you. You know, it's no different really. If you've got parents telling little girls from a very young age, and schools now, and feminist politicians, etc., repeating this bullshit everywhere they get the opportunity to, that there is a culture of rape and misogyny is rampant, etc., etc., stands to reason that this is going to exacerbate these issues within the mindset of girls. And I'm not disputing and I'm not denying that there is, to some degree, more of a requirement and more of something that does occur, more of a need to prompt girls to be more careful when they're out and about. There's no denying that. But I do think that politicians, especially in Scotland, have to take a look at themselves in terms of, or ask themselves, do they make it worse by the shit that they say? Fucking hell, half an hour already. We are advocating that women should be encouraged to report misogynistic crimes of all kind, even where they themselves cannot name the perpetrator or where they feel the matter is unlikely to proceed to courts. Having no agency in the face of misogynistic conduct is one of the most distressing aspects of the experience. The reporting of misogynistic aggravated crime and the new offences will allow for the collection of statistics of harassment and a proper analysis of the conduct women are experiencing and where it most often occurs. And I'd like for the definitions or for these terms to be more broadly defined. What do we mean when we're referring to harassment, etc. online, or just in general? Because there's another classic example of a word that's been redefined as time has gone on, or the goalposts have been expanded anyway. You know, so when women make these complaints claiming that they're the victim of misogynistic abuse, etc., etc., are they really though? I love this bit. Our recommendation, however, then, is that this new law should be created exclusively for women, and those perceived to be women. Reflecting the inherently gendered nature of the problem we have been asked to address, the emphasis of such a law is to shift the focus from women as victims to the men who perpetrate these crimes. These proposals do not infringe on the principle of equality before the law. The huge body of evidence presented to the working group presented in this report and its annexes leaves us in no doubt that women and girls need protecting from misogynistic conduct and that separate law can be justified. And a separate law, can be justified. Here's another fucking paragraph for the waffle. People who are gender fluid will say that women only law simply embeds the gender binary within our current society, but we have to deal with our current world, which is racked with epidemic levels of violence and abuse against women and girls. If misogyny is not addressed, there will never be an equal society, and there will never be. What the fuck? You might think that's me mumbling my words. No, it's the way this is worded. There will never be an equal society, and there will never be acceptance of anyone who does not conform. Misogyny is about making women conform and stay in line. Misogyny is a problem at the very core of our society. Until that is fixed, no one will enjoy real freedom to be who they are. Ugh. It is admirable and right that Scotland holds the ambition of ridding itself of misogyny altogether. It is an ambition for serious social change. It will be no mean feat, but making a strong start by creating new laws specifically created for women will be a clear declaration of intents. These recommendations are intended to reach deeper into the foundations of inequality. They are purposely framed to create a profound shake-up. There will undoubtedly be opposition from those who are wedded to the old order, but women and men who want a better society for themselves and for future generations will embrace the spirit, if not the letter, of this report. Change has to come and society is ready for it. Oh yeah. Anyhow, let's see. The working group's remit was developed from a number of sources, including the first report of the First Minister's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls, which included a recommendation to criminalise serious misogynistic harassment, filling gaps in existing laws. Oh, what a shock. Man, no one knew that I had a finger in this pie. In response to this recommendation and calls from women's organisations to explore this issue in more detail, the working group was established under independent leadership to consider how the criminal law deals with misogynistic harassment, including whether there are gaps in legislation that could be filled with a specific offence of misogynistic harassment. So phase 1 was building a picture of the experiences of women and girls in Scotland and internationally, applying a gender analytical lens through the consideration of existing data sets, literature reviews and lived experience, setting out the principles which will support a shared understanding of how these experiences are influenced and are driven by misogynistic behaviour and our attitudes, and where this behaviour is or should be a criminal offence. Phase 2, it says to consider the outputs of phase 1 and map these into criminal law in Scotland as it stands, by identifying whether there are gaps in existing law and or whether there is a failure to implement existing legislation in ways that protect women and girls. In addition, the group will consider whether sex should be included within the hate crime framework and to be introduced at a later date, an appropriate date following introduction of hate crime legislation. When they mean sex, they mean women. Work collaboratively to develop a specific definition of misogyny within a Scottish legal context. Yeah, let's just take the term misogyny, scrap the original definition, and redefine it to suit our narrative. Yes, okay. And attribute a plethora of different things that are wrong, admittedly. Crimes, yes. Disgusting, aye. But wrongly attribute them all to misogyny, despite the fact that they can happen when it's not a male who is the perpetrator. Let's see. In his independent review of hate crime legislation in Scotland, Lord Bracadale states that the term misogyny is used a lot in the context of the debate about offending based on gender. This is a term which has changed in usage over time. In its second edition, the Short Oxford English Dictionary defined misogyny as hatred of women. This was updated in the third edition to hatred or dislike of or prejudice against women. Many organisations, or women's organisations, incorporate a sense of imbalance of power when articulating what is meant by misogyny, the exact same way that these people, the anti-racists, have taken the term racism and they attribute privilege plus power to be the more accurate definition, when that's absolutely not what the old dictionaries would suggest it is. I'm noticing Donald Trump, for fuck's sake. For example, Engender, the feminist shit show organisation in Scotland, define it as a system or actions that deliberately subordinate women and reflect the actors' understanding that women are not their equals. You know, so when a man catcalls a woman, or whatever it may be, he does so because he's viewing the world through the same lens as Engender. And he believes that women are subordinate. Okay. Some people treat the terms misogyny and sexism as synonymous, while others would argue that misogyny is often more targeted or negative and used to assert male dominance over women. What about misandry then? How would we define that? I would agree that misogyny and sexism are somewhat different, because sexism is just... Well, actually, no. I would say that they're relatively similar. They're only different if you're viewing misogyny as a word that can be redefined, which they've done. It was apparent to me in the course of this review that different people use the term misogyny to mean slightly different things, and I suspect that its meaning may continue to evolve over time. That is beautiful stuff. Given the remit of this working group, it was essential first to progress from people using the term misogyny to mean slightly different things to a clear working definition that could anchor discussions and recommendations. The creation of this definition involves seeking guidance from academics and experts with a determination to move on from the literal and etymological notion that misogynistic behaviour stems from hating women. The notion of hatred in this context fails to capture the way in which the term misogyny is now being used to describe thoughts or feelings that result in behaviours that routinely, rather than exceptionally, undermine, devalue or degrade women and girls. So the group recognised that many perpetrators of what could be characterised as misogynistic behaviour would claim to love women, may well live with women or have relationships with women. After all, Donald Trump has claimed to love women, but also appears unashamed to have been recorded describing how his power enables him to grab women by the pussy. You can do anything. Oh my god. Fuck's sake. No comment, man. I mean, why would I even address that bullshit? A shared premise, equally safe and violence against women and girls. The vision and objectives of Equally Safe, Scotland's strategy to prevent and eradicate violence against women and girls. Again, no, this is a bit of a misleading title. Violence against women and girls incorporates a hell of a lot more than what you would initially think when you hear the term violence. Anyhow, Equally Safe's definition of violence against women and girls points to a wide spectrum of behaviours, as well as implicitly by describing this violence as gender-based, to the power imbalances between men and women that enable and perpetuate these acts of violence. So that includes things such as underrepresentation, things such as that. It's not quite as clear-cut as saying violence, because it's power imbalances, behaviours, attitudes, etc. Violence against women and girls, encompasses, but is not limited to, physical, sexual and psychological violence occurring in the family, within the general community or in institutions, including domestic abuse, rape and incest. What else have we got here? Sexual harassment, bullying and intimidation in any public or private space, including work, etc. Commercial sexual exploitation, including prostitution, lap dancing, stripping, porn. Child sex abuse, including family sexual abuse, or familial sexual abuse, so-called honour-based violence, including dowry-related violence, female genital mutilation, forced and child marriages, and honour crimes. The considerations and recommendations of this review are wholly aligned with and are complementary to the vision and objectives of Equally Safe. Further, the working group was mindful of the work of Liz Kelly and others in the spectrum of sexual violence, as neatly captured by Megan Hoyt, saying, "Not all manifestations of patriarchal control look or feel violent. Some may seem relatively trivial. However, when connected to the broader spectrum of violence, the reality is that many women may experience even minor events as threatening." Okay. So the report was commissioned by the government, and of course his recommendations are for them. However, the working group's hope is that this report will both be a provocation and an inspiration to those who work in the criminal justice system, in education and business leadership, as well as those with policy influence with and beyond Scotland. Beautiful, bold and brave. So I skipped a few pages, conscious of time, really conscious of time, but they go on to talk about all the steps that were taken in order to eventually come up with the definition that they were going to use for misogyny. That definition, of course, being a way of thinking that upholds the primary status of men and a sense of male entitlement while subordinating women and limiting their power and freedom. Conduct based on this thinking can include a range of abusive and controlling behaviours, including rape, sexual offences, harassment and bullying, and domestic abuse. Okay. The definition is deliberately non-legal and provided the working group with a starting point from which to consider the degree to which current law protects women from these behaviours. They then refer to a survey, or their survey even, and the wider body of evidence. If this is what they're defining as evidence, then I'm sorry. First and foremost, it's anecdotal. Secondly, you have to also take into consideration when you have a working group whose end goal is potentially to see misogyny becoming a standalone hate crime protection or standalone offence incorporated into the hate crime bill, stands to the reason you're going to have feministic type people taking advantage of any survey that group produces or releases even. Always have to take that into consideration. But thirdly, I will also concede that naturally some of these things will be true, because there is some Fruit Loops out there is some distasteful people out there, and there's obviously drunk people as well. But again, I don't understand how that can be attributed to misogyny. Anyway, a couple of these examples. I was called a fucking whore when I politely told a man chatting me up in the pub that I was married. Okay. There were so many instances of sexual harassment and assault at school, it's hard to even know where to begin. Well, when I went to school, it was near enough non-existent, so who's right, who's wrong, who's telling the truth, who's no? Or it could just be your area, who knows? Since the age of 13, I have been experiencing boys looking up my skirt and lifting my kilt up. On quite a few occasions I knew that they were taking photos up my kilt, but I was too embarrassed to say anything. We never had the option to wear trousers to prevent it. I have been whistled at and catcalled numerous times in the street. Once a group of men passed me and one of them grabbed their crotch and asked if I wanted a taste of their sausage. Okay. When I was at college, two men called me names and made fun of me. They said sexual things to me. I was bullied a lot and the lecturers would not do anything about it, so I dropped out of college. Being threatened by a man in a pub for not laughing at what he thought was a funny remark. Myself and female partner were out running and a group of young people were walking towards us. One of the young men started shouting, specifically lesbianic misogyny. Shouting, fucking lesies. Misogyny. Oh, for fuck's sake. I had been called a slut in a car park because I accidentally moved my trolley too close to a man's car. Misogyny, folks. There were so many instances of sexual harassment and assault at school. I've read that. And of course, something that No Chance made a video on a while ago, and I'll link it down below if I remember. UN Women UK research published in March of 2021 found that only 3% of 18 to 24-year-olds reported having not experienced any of the types of sexual harassment listed within the survey. No Chance pretty much debunked this bullshit for what it was, so I'm not even going to waste my time going through any paragraphs that are related to that shite. You know? Amnesty conducted a study across 8 countries, including the UK, which reported on the psychological impact of online abuse. Ugh, that's irrelevant shite, who cares? Other examples of misogynistic behaviour that the working group considered was a brick thrown through the window of a well-known feminist or vandalising the car of a woman who started a campaign on a woman's issue. Whilst there are recognisable crimes in these examples, it is also clear that there was a misogynistic element. Well, it depends on how you define misogyny, eh? In line with the working group's definition, the behaviour involved in the crime demonstrates a sense of entitlement. For fuck's a subordination of women, and as a consequence, limiting of their power and freedom. I mean, it's just fucking stupid. I'm sorry, just total pish. Anyhow, the experiences and incidents described above make it clear that misogyny is a fact of women and girls' lives. This section describes the impact it has on their feelings, attitudes and decisions, with only 0.7% of the survey respondents reporting that the experience of misogynistic behaviour did not impact them. Impacts appear to vary with age. The most common impact on respondents' feelings reported amongst 18 to 34-year-olds was to feel uncomfortable. Over 3/4 reported feeling this way compared to just under 2/3 should be shit of 35 to 59-year-olds, and just over half of the respondents over 60. Oh god. Let's skip some of this, I think. Safety work is the term Liz Kelly used to describe the strategizing and planning that women and girls undertake in responding to and avoiding and or coping with men's violence. The vast majority of this work is preemptive. We often can't even know if what we are experiencing is intrusive without external confirmation. That confirmation generally comes in the form of escalation. He moves from starting to touch you, he walks quicker behind you, he blocks your path. This escalation is what safety work is designed to disrupt. Women learn to quickly make changes, continually evaluating the situation to decide what constitutes the right amount of panic. Such work, repeated over time, becomes habitual. It is absorbed into the body as a kind of hidden labour. The prevalence of women undertaking safety work is clear from the lived experience survey, with many respondents reported changing their behaviour as a result of misogynistic incidents. Misogynistic. Sake, man. Say the F word, of course, gets a mention. It is clear from the body of evidence that misogyny operates at epidemic levels, not just in Scotland but across the UK. From the evidence and from natural inference, the impact of this epidemic on women and girls' participation in society is clear. Why put your hand up in school if it draws attention to you and puts you at greater risk of misogynistic abuse, harassment or derision? Why put yourself forward for a promotion or pay rise if it increases your visibility and therefore your risk of misogynistic abuse? Why speak up or out offline or on if the result may be anything from degrading remarks about your physical appearance or desirability to a rape threat? Misogynistic abuse has chillingly been cited as the reason for women withdrawing from public life. Of course, there are women who live full lives regardless of this epidemic, but it is nevertheless clear that misogynistic act, whether trivial or serious, undermines not only the victim, but the progress, confidence and feeling of belonging to society of the vast majority of women. And what about the vast majority of women that abuse other women online? We can't talk about that though, because that completely destroys the narrative that we're trying to present here, which is that of men doing what they do to women purely because of misogyny. Total fucking bullshit. What about men and misandry? By necessity within the remit of this review, the evidence in this report refers to the experiences of women. Misandry was not featured. A parallel between misogyny and misandry, feelings of hating men, is immediately problematic when considered within the working group's definition of misogyny. Of course there are instances of men being abused or harassed, but it's difficult to reverse the logic of the misogyny definition and to interpret abuse or harassment of men as upholding their primary status of women, a sense of female entitlement, and a subordination of men. Well, that's what happens when you start redefining fucking words, eh? Misogyny and misandry used to mean the exact same thing in terms of hatred of X, insert X. But instead of that now you've decided to redefine misogyny, but leave misandry to remain as an old definition, to remain on an old definition. Fucking pish. So that's the excuse. Well, we can't include misandry, in any discussions going forward because, it kind of doesn't really work when we try to reverse the definition. Fucking pish. Absolute waffle. And all in all, the vast majority of this is just page after page of nonsense. Sort of thing that you would expect to find in a working group's report. Paragraph after paragraph of anecdotes and, doing everything in their power to try and justify misogyny and giving you random examples such as showing women porn, etc. I was like, what the fuck? But purely because the length of this video is getting at, and by this point, everybody knows the vast majority of what's been suggested and recommended by this group, but funnily enough, I've managed to stop it on the correct page to finish this off. The working group therefore recommends the creation of Misogyny and Criminal Justice Scotland Act would create a new statutory aggravation where a crime such as assault, criminal damage, threatening or abusive behaviour is aggravated by misogyny, create a new offence of stirring up hatred against women and girls, create a new offence of public misogynistic harassment, and to create a new offence of issuing threats and or evoking rape, etc. of women and girls online. These are intended as a holistic response, not a menu of options. The working group concluded that the legislative change is essential but insufficient to address the insidious problem with misogyny that doesn't really exist if we look at the old definition in Scotland. In addition, therefore, to the creation of a Misogyny Act, the working group recommends that the government involves all relevant stakeholders, including all women's groups and Police Scotland, in implementation of the Misogyny Act, provide sufficient resources for education, of course, and training within the criminal justice system, and for multi-agency support and awareness, medics, dentists, etc., as well as the development of any new interventions such as awareness training required for diversions to social workers, blah blah blah. Resourcing social work and other interventions is required by prosecution policy, technology capability and police officer capacity for recording and reporting, campaigning and awareness within public institutions, where education again gets a mention, learning from projects and good practice in other places and jurisdictions, e.g. Nottingham, Washington, etc. Right, and on that note, I think I'm just going to fucking leave it at that because there's just too many pages and it's waffle. And I've had enough feminist shit for one day. So, on that note, peace.